15 years of my life ended in less than 10 minutes. Not because I was careless. Not because I failed. But because decisions had already been made long before I walked into that room. They didn't call it a termination. They never do. They called it strategic transition. Words chosen carefully, polished until they sounded harmless. Words designed to soften the moment so no one had to sit with what was really happening. When I entered the conference room, no one looked surprised to see me. 3 executives sat on one side of the table, posture relaxed, eyes already detached. An HR representative sat slightly back, hands folded, avoiding eye contact as if empathy might be contagious. And then there was him, the reason I was there. Young. Confident. Calm in a way that only exists when someone else is about to pay the price. His last name carried influence. Mine carried memory. And in that room, memory was treated like excess weight slowing the company down. "This isn't easy," the COO said, using the same tone he reserved for earnings calls that missed projections and press statements written by lawyers. His voice didn't shake. His hands didn't hesitate. Everything about him suggested this moment had already been rehearsed. Probably multiple times, in front of a mirror or with the HR department coaching him on tone and pacing. He spoke about change. About momentum. About the need to appear modern in an industry that rewarded speed over stability. He mentioned my contributions briefly, almost out of obligation, then paused, waiting, perhaps, for gratitude. Or maybe for me to make this easier for him by agreeing, by nodding. By playing the part of someone who understood and accepted their own irrelevance. I didn't give him any. They never said my name when they told me my position was being eliminated. They didn't have to. By then, I was already being spoken about as if I were an idea that no longer fit the narrative. The CFO shifted in her seat, clearing her throat before adding her own carefully rehearsed remarks. She spoke about market conditions, about competitive pressures, about the necessity of staying agile in an evolving landscape. Her words formed a perfect shield, corporate language designed to deflect accountability while sounding reasonable. She mentioned restructuring as if it were weather, something that simply happened rather than something deliberately chosen by people sitting in rooms exactly like this one. I watched her mouth move. I heard the words. But I also saw what she couldn't hide, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her eyes kept drifting to the documents in front of her as if reading from a script she'd memorized but didn't quite believe. She had been with the company almost as long as I had. We had worked together on projects that saved millions. Now she sat across from me, delivering lines someone else had written. The youngest executive, the one whose influence outweighed his experience, said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was the statement. His silence was louder than any explanation they could offer. He checked his phone once, briefly, as if this meeting were just another item on a list of tasks to complete before lunch. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask what would happen to the systems I built. Or the safeguards only I understood. I listened. Because in that moment, something became very clear. This meeting wasn't about removing me. That had already happened quietly, piece by piece, over the past year. This was simply the formal conclusion. The administrative cleanup of a decision that had been made in different rooms, during different conversations, by people who had never asked what I actually did. The HR folder slid across the table toward me. Thick paper. Clean formatting. Severance terms laid out with clinical precision. Everything neat. Everything final. I noticed the way it had been prepared, tabs marking where I needed to sign, post-it notes indicating relevant sections, highlighted passages that required initials. Someone had spent time making this process efficient. Making my exit smooth. Making it easy for them to forget I had ever been necessary. The severance package was generous by some standards. Enough to suggest gratitude without requiring it. Enough to make legal challenge seem petty. Enough to buy silence without ever asking for it directly. I signed where they told me to sign. My handwriting looked steady on the page. Each signature felt mechanical, like signing forms at a bank or a doctor's office. Routine. Unremarkable. When I stood up, the COO extended his hand. His grip was damp. Mine was steady. I noticed the slight surprise in his eyes. Perhaps he expected emotion, or resistance, or at least questions. Instead, he got silence. And silence, I had learned, made people more uncomfortable than any argument ever could. It denied them the closure of a reaction. It left them wondering what I was thinking, what I might do next. Whether this was really as simple as they wanted it to be. No one followed me out. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. Not because I felt embarrassed, but because I felt strangely empty. No anger. No shock. Just a silence that settled deep in my chest. I counted the floors as they descended. Watched the numbers decrease. Felt the subtle pull of gravity as the elevator slowed, then stopped. The lobby was the same as it had been that morning. Same marble floors. Same security desk. Same filtered light through tinted windows. Nothing had changed except my relationship to all of it. I was no longer part of this space. I was passing through it for the last time. I walked past the security desk without stopping. The guard glanced up, recognized me, then looked away quickly. Word traveled fast in buildings like this. He already knew I was no longer someone who belonged here. Outside, the air felt different. Colder. Sharper. Or maybe I was just noticing it for the first time in years. And in that silence, I understood something they hadn't considered yet. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs. That meeting didn't come out of nowhere. It only felt sudden because the final cut is always cleaner than the slow erosion that comes before it. For nearly a year, I had been fading from the center without realizing it. Not removed. Not confronted. Just shifted. Slightly out of frame. Enough that no one would notice when I was finally gone. It started with small absences. A meeting invite that never arrived. A follow-up scheduled without me. Reports I had written being summarized by someone else and presented as insight. At first, I corrected them. I explained what had been left out. I reminded them why certain decisions had been made the way they were. They nodded. They thanked me. Then they proceeded without changing a thing. That was when I understood the shift. Accuracy was no longer the priority. Agreement was. The signs were everywhere once I learned to see them. Email chains that suddenly went quiet when I was added. Conversations that shifted tone the moment I entered a room. Questions directed at others even when I was the one with the answer. It wasn't hostility. That would have been easier to name. It was something more subtle, a collective decision to look past me, as if I were already transparent. Consultants began appearing more frequently. Young, confident, armed with slides and borrowed certainty. They asked questions that sounded intelligent until you realized they had never lived. With the consequences of their answers. Why is this process so complex? Why does this approval take so long? Can't we simplify this? I answered patiently at first. Then briefly. Then not at all. Because when leadership starts calling experience legacy, the outcome has already been decided. The consultants never stayed long enough to see what happened after their recommendations were implemented. They delivered their presentations, collected their fees, and moved on to the next company. They had no stake in the outcome. No responsibility for what broke 6 months later. No connection to the people who would have to fix what they had simplified beyond function. My role didn't vanish overnight. It eroded. Decisions were made before I entered the room. I was invited afterward, asked to review outcomes I had once shaped from the beginning. My name stopped appearing on critical documents. Not removed deliberately, just omitted. As if someone had simply forgotten to include me, and then everyone else followed that pattern until forgetting became policy. I watched as protocols I had designed were rewritten by people who didn't understand why they existed. Safeguards were removed not because they were unnecessary, but because they were inconvenient. Risk assessments were shortened to fit presentation slides. Nuance was treated as obstruction. Silence became my position. I trained department heads who now outranked me in influence. I stayed late stabilizing systems that no one acknowledged because nothing failed. And when nothing fails, people assume nothing is required. They saw smooth operations and concluded that complexity was optional. They never asked what maintained that smoothness. They never wondered what prevented the failures. They never witnessed. That's the danger of competence. When things run smoothly, skill becomes invisible. And invisible things are easy to replace. I noticed the way they looked at me when I spoke. The subtle impatience. The tightening of expressions when I questioned projections that sounded too optimistic. I wasn't difficult. I was inconvenient. I represented a perspective they no longer wanted to hear, one that acknowledged risk. That planned for failure, that understood success required more than enthusiasm and ambition. They wanted speed. I represented restraint. They wanted simplicity. I carried complexity they didn't understand. Meetings became performances. Everyone said the right things, used the right language, projected the right confidence. Doubt was reframed as resistance. Questions were treated as obstacles. The goal wasn't to make better decisions. It was to make decisions that felt better. I started documenting more carefully. Not for protection, but for clarity. I wanted to understand what was happening, to see the pattern beyond the individual moments. I kept copies of emails where my recommendations were acknowledged, then ignored. I saved versions of reports that showed how conclusions changed after I was no longer involved in the process. Not as evidence, as understanding. By the time the meeting arrived, my office was already half empty. Boxes stacked neatly against the wall. Someone had wrapped my belongings efficiently, without curiosity or care. A yellow label sat on top of the nearest box. Personal effects. No name. No acknowledgement. They had prepared thoroughly for my exit. They hadn't prepared at all for my absence. I found out later that they had already hired someone to replace me. Before the termination meeting, a younger candidate with impressive credentials and no experience with systems as complex as ours. Someone who wouldn't question the new direction. Someone who would fit the culture they were building, fast, optimistic, unencumbered by memory. The transition plan was minimal. A few documents. A brief meeting. No time allocated for the transfer of knowledge that couldn't be written down. They treated institutional understanding like data you could simply copy from one person to another. They believed replacement was simple. They would learn otherwise. On my final day, I went back to my office alone. No one stopped me. No one questioned why I was still there. In their minds, I had already been processed. Reduced to paperwork. Turned into an administrative task that had been completed and archived. The room felt unfamiliar, like a place I no longer belonged to. Or maybe it had always been this way, and I was only just noticing it now that obligation was gone. Boxes lined the wall, sealed and labeled by someone who didn't know me well enough to hesitate. My desk was cleared. My computer disconnected. As if access itself was dangerous once my name was no longer attached to a title. But there was one thing they missed. A drawer at the bottom of my desk. Locked. Slightly stiff from disuse. Inside was a thin binder. No label. No markings. Nothing that would catch the eye of someone rushing to clean a space for its next occupant. Inside were years of quiet work. Internal audits that never made it past middle management. Risk maps showing where systems depended on assumptions instead of safeguards. Reports I had written late at night, aware that they would be filed, acknowledged, and ignored. Documentation of decisions that had been overridden, warnings that had been dismissed, projections that had been adjusted to match desired outcomes rather than probable realities. It wasn't leverage. It wasn't proof meant for retaliation. And it wasn't something I planned to take. It was understanding. I didn't need the binder. Every page already lived in my head. Every vulnerability. Every workaround. Every reason something existed the way it did. I had spent 15 years building systems that anticipated failure because I understood that failure was inevitable. The question was never whether things would break, it was whether they would break in ways we could manage. They spoke about progress as if it were an upgrade you could install without checking what still functioned beneath the surface. They believed complexity was a flaw rather than a response to reality. They saw the layers I had built and called them bureaucracy. They never understood that each layer existed because something had gone wrong before, because someone had learned a lesson the hard way, because experience had taught us where the weak points were. They never asked who built the escalation paths. Who decided which failures were survivable? Who taught the system how to recover quietly, without attention? They didn't forget those things. They never learned them. And when people don't understand something, they assume it can be replaced. I flipped through the binder one last time. Page after page of careful analysis. Scenarios mapped out. Dependencies documented. Each page represented hours of work that no one had valued enough to protect. I thought about taking it with me. Not as a weapon, but as a record. Proof that I had tried to do this right. But in the end, I left it where it was. Locked in the drawer. Hidden in plain sight. If they found it later, they might read it. They might finally understand what they had dismantled. Or they might throw it away, assuming it was obsolete the moment I left. Either way, it was no longer my responsibility. I locked the drawer, closed the office door, and walked away. Not angry. Not bitter. Just certain. The hallway was empty as I made my way to the elevator. Most people were in meetings or focused on their screens. A few glanced up as I passed, then quickly looked away. No one said goodbye. No one asked where I was going. The silence felt deliberate, as if acknowledging my departure would make it too real, too uncomfortable. I wondered how long it would take before someone needed something I used to handle. A system behaving unexpectedly. A client asking a question that required institutional memory. A problem that couldn't be solved. With optimism and a consultant's slide deck. Days, maybe. Weeks at most. 2 days after I left, my phone rang while I was standing at my kitchen counter, staring at a mug I hadn't finished. The number wasn't saved. I hesitated for half a second, long enough to remember that I didn't owe anyone my time anymore. I answered. Ms. Whitmore, the voice said, calm and unhurried. My name is Elliot Crane. I'm calling because I was told you might be open to a conversation. Off the record. He didn't mention where he was calling from. He didn't reference my former company. That restraint told me more than an introduction ever could. This wasn't a recruiter reading from a script. This was someone who understood that timing mattered, that approach mattered, that people who had been pushed out needed space before they could move forward. We met later that afternoon in a quiet cafe far from glass offices. and polished lobbies. Elliot arrived early. No laptop open. No slides. No rehearsed enthusiasm. He asked questions that cut through surface explanations and went straight to pressure points. Where do systems fail after years of success? What happens when leadership optimizes for optics instead of durability? Which decisions feel efficient in the moment but cost the most later? I answered without defending myself. Without translating my experience into language meant to impress. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't being measured, I was being listened to. Then he said something that shifted the conversation. We've been studying companies that collapsed slowly, he said. Not because of market forces, but because they misunderstood what kept them stable. Your name kept coming up. He wasn't looking for secrets. He wasn't asking for inside knowledge. He wanted perspective. Grounded in lived consequence. He understood that the most valuable insights come from people who have watched systems fail, who have learned what warnings look like before anyone else notices them. They didn't offer me a title. They didn't promise authority. They offered me autonomy. Space to think. Space to design. Space to build without explaining why depth mattered. I agreed to work quietly. Remotely. No announcements. No press. I didn't need visibility. I needed freedom. Freedom to apply everything I had learned without having to justify every decision to people who measured success in quarters rather than years. That night, I realized I hadn't thought about the meeting once. The past lost its grip not because it had been resolved, but because it no longer defined me. I didn't hear about my former company all at once. It reached me in fragments, the way structural failures always do. Before anyone admits they exist. A delayed response time mentioned casually in a private industry thread. A missed deadline reframed as a temporary adjustment. A client quietly rerouting part of their workload elsewhere, without explanation or confrontation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would trigger alarms in executive meetings. Just small inconsistencies where precision used to live. Systems built on balance don't collapse suddenly. They drift. Alignment loosens. Dependencies slip out of sync. At first, everything still functions well enough to avoid panic. That's the dangerous phase, when leadership convinces itself the issue is perception rather than structure. Their response was predictable. Simplify. Accelerate. Remove friction. Processes were shortened. Approval layers removed. Decisions centralized under people who had never managed consequences beyond presentation decks. And optimistic forecasts. Safeguards were labeled inefficient. Redundancy became waste. Caution was reframed as hesitation. The people now responsible for oversight asked the wrong questions. They asked how to move faster. They asked how to consolidate. They asked how to make results visible sooner. They never asked what those systems were protecting them from. Meanwhile, I worked quietly. I built frameworks that assumed failure instead of denying it. I designed logic that treated human error as inevitable rather than unacceptable. Structures that didn't need constant explanation to justify their existence. There were no announcements. No internal memos. No applause. Just systems that held under pressure. Occasionally, a former colleague would reach out. Carefully. Indirectly. Asking how I was. Mentioning challenges without describing them. I listened without offering advice. Not out of resentment. But because my role there had ended. The contrast became harder to ignore. While my former company spoke publicly about innovation, their operations grew brittle. While they showcased new leadership, trust quietly migrated elsewhere. Stability isn't something people celebrate. They only notice it once it's gone. And by the time they noticed, recovery was no longer a question of effort, but of time they no longer had. The real damage didn't come from one failure. It came from hesitation. When systems stopped behaving the way leadership expected, no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Meetings multiplied. Language softened. Responsibility blurred. Everyone waited for someone else to confirm what they were already sensing. I could see the pattern from the outside. When clarity disappears, people replace it with optimism. When accountability weakens, meetings grow longer. When no one understands the whole structure, decisions shrink to whatever feels safest in the moment. They began reacting instead of managing. Temporary fixes became permanent solutions. Short-term wins were celebrated while long-term stability quietly eroded. Teams were asked to compensate for structural flaws with effort instead of design. Burnout followed. Turnover increased. Knowledge fragmented. People who once trusted the system stopped trusting each other. And when trust disappears internally, clients feel it almost immediately. I watched from a distance as familiar names left quietly. Engineers. Analysts. People who understood how things actually worked. Each departure took something with it: context, memory, restraint. Leadership responded with messaging. Town halls, emails, reassurance that everything was under control. It wasn't. Control doesn't vanish all at once. It thins. It spreads too wide. Until no one can say with confidence who owns what anymore. Meanwhile, the work I was doing moved in the opposite direction. Clear ownership. Defined limits. Systems that didn't rely on heroics to function. The difference wasn't visible yet. But it was growing. The first real shift didn't happen inside my former company. It happened around it. Conversations changed tone. Questions became more careful. Decisions that once felt automatic began requiring justification. Clients didn't complain. They adjusted. And adjustment is always more telling than confrontation. I started hearing familiar names in unfamiliar contexts. People I once worked with showing up elsewhere. Quiet moves. No announcements. Just transitions that suggested confidence had thinned. The industry notices patterns long before leadership does. When reliability fades, it doesn't create panic. It creates options. Competitors didn't attack. They waited. They positioned themselves as alternatives without saying the word. And clients always sense when the foundation under something familiar starts to feel less certain. Meanwhile, the work I was doing remained intentionally invisible. No branding push. No thought leadership campaigns. We focused on execution. On consistency. On making sure nothing failed loudly. Success didn't arrive as a headline. It arrived as absence. Absence of outages. Absence of escalations. Absence of last-minute fixes. That's how trust forms. Quietly. Repeatedly. Without ceremony. I never spoke publicly about where I had come from. The systems spoke for themselves. Performance reports circulated without my name attached. While my former company tried to reassure stakeholders that everything was under control, the industry was already making other plans. The opportunity that changed everything didn't arrive with noise. It arrived as an assumption. A multi-year contract, widely believed to be already decided. The kind executives speak about before signatures are dry. My former company had held similar contracts before. They had grown comfortable with expectation. This time, the process was different. Open. Quiet. Clinical. No legacy advantage. Just requirements, benchmarks, and consequences. We submitted our proposal without commentary. Just architecture. Logic. Systems designed for pressure, not applause. I didn't sign my name. I didn't attend presentations. Weeks passed. Then months. The decision arrived in the most unremarkable way possible. A brief message. The contract had gone elsewhere. Not because my former company failed spectacularly. But because someone else demonstrated consistency without spectacle. That's how leadership shifts. Not through collapse. Through replacement. After the decision circulated. Quietly, my inbox changed. It started carefully. A short message from a familiar name, framed as curiosity. A suggestion to reconnect. I didn't reply. Then came the second wave. Longer messages. References to lessons learned and unfortunate timing. The language of regret, polished just enough to feel sincere without admitting fault. One message suggested coffee. Another mentioned collaboration. A third hinted at advisory roles. I read each one carefully. They weren't reaching out because they valued me now. They were reaching out because something they relied on no longer existed. Power doesn't come from being invited back. It comes from no longer needing the invitation. I archived every message without responding. Not out of anger. Out of completion. People like to imagine revenge as something loud. A confrontation. A reveal. That was never my version of it. What happened next didn't unfold in headlines. It happened quietly, through decisions no one bothered to announce. My former company didn't collapse overnight. It narrowed. Slowly. Opportunity by opportunity. The world didn't turn against them. It simply moved on. Meanwhile, the work I was doing continued without interruption. Just systems that functioned as intended. At some point, I stopped tracking what happened to the place I left. Not because I forgave them, but because their trajectory no longer intersected with mine. Closure doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from relevance ending. I found something I hadn't expected, clarity. The kind that only arrives when you're no longer trying to prove your value to people who decided long ago not to see it. No one asked me to simplify what mattered. No one questioned why caution existed. No one treated experience like an obstacle. I wasn't louder. I wasn't faster. I was simply aligned with people who understood the cost of pretending systems don't fail. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about momentum. And momentum doesn't announce itself when it shifts. It simply carries forward, without asking who's ready.